to have a special guest. We have with us Drew Tibbetts and Rachel Dorn with the CoStar Group. And in case you are not familiar with CoStar, they're the big building that's downtown Richmond. And Rachel is a software engineer for CoStar, and she will be talking with you about ways in which you can gain software skills. So I'll go ahead and turn it on over to you, Rachel, and I'll go ahead and get started on your PowerPoint.
Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, so while we're waiting for the slides to get pulled up, I'm Rachel Dorn. I'm a software engineer at CoStar. I've been there about 3 years now, and today I'm going to be talking about the fact that working in industry is fairly different from being a student. And while some of it is applicable, there's some skills in particular that you won't really get until you're on the job. And so a way to practice those in advance so you're not blindsided when you go into your first job in industry. Next slide, please. Would you mind hitting just the present so that they're the full screen?
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Yeah, so before I dive into it, a little bit about me. So I actually came at software development from a little bit of a non-traditional route. I was a liberal arts college student. I have a degree in film and economics, which I'm not using. But then I actually took some computer science in high school and then decided that senior year, I didn't want to be a film producer and I wanted to go back into software because I like doing it. And so I started teaching myself some front-end development in the evenings. And then after I graduated, I moved down to Richmond and was lucky enough to be accepted into Max Potential's technical apprenticeship. So that's a company here in Richmond that functions a bit like a small agency where they'll actually mentor you to give you sort of like the on-the-job skills. So I did that for a year. And then out of that, I was hired by a company called Authentic, also in Richmond, which is a small agency where I worked as a front-end developer. I was there for about a year and then left in 2018 to work for CoStar because I wanted to do a bit more JavaScript versus like HTML, CSS work. And I've been at CoStar since. I really like working there. And then since I didn't have that computer science academic background, I decided to actually go back to school at VCU to take some classes, and I just finished up the computer science post-bac certificate this year. So I've come at the industry from sort of like small company, large company, academia, working. So I've got a pretty broad perspective and can talk to a number of different angles on it. Next slide, please. I believe you skipped a couple.
No, that's my computer. Okay.
So this talk is I titled it "Your Degree is Not Enough," but that by no means says that your degree is not worth anything. It definitely is. So something like there's sort of 3 big areas that I think having a degree in computer science is super beneficial. First and foremost, you have an incredibly strong technical foundation. So anything that you encounter, whether it's a new language, a new framework, what have you, like you're gonna have that core knowledge that's gonna make learning that new set of skills so much simpler. Secondly, the work ethic that you get from just being a student and having to take multiple classes and just being so busy. I definitely think that college classes, the pace is faster than anything I've ever encountered at work. Like never once has my job required me to do a full project in 2 weeks, which is something that you routinely have to do. So having that background and being able to work at that speed is going to be very useful because there will inevitably be crunch times, and it's good to have that something that you're used to doing. The third thing that's super beneficial is connections. All the development jobs I've had, I've gotten from a referral. I've known somebody who worked there who recommended me in, and that's definitely a huge benefit since you have all of your classmates you're gonna spread all over, be at different companies. So I'd recommend like staying in touch with people because you never know, uh, they might be somewhere that you're trying to go. Next slide, please. So you have a lot of skills already, and you're very well positioned to enter the industry. And what I'm going to talk about today are sort of some of the things that you won't get in your classes. And I've divided these into 3 categories: so hard skills, soft skills, and the right mindset. Next slide, please. So first off, hard skills. These are going to be the more technical ones. Next slide. So if you take away nothing else from this presentation, it is that you should learn Git. Git is super important to just no matter front end, back end, whatever, Git is important. If you've never encountered Git before, it's version control software. So what it does is it allows you to save drafts essentially of your code, as well as you can create a branch off of. So if the project has one main code base and you've got, say, 6 people working on it, you can all branch off of it and create your own lanes to play around with, mess with the code, get it to a stable point with your changes, separate from that main body of code. So you're not overwriting other people's work as you're both working on the same project. It allows you to go back if you make mistakes, and just keep a record of all of the changes that have happened, as well as giving a really nice process for reviewing code. So if you make your changes and then you're ready for them to be put into, it's called merged into the main repository, you can have people, probably like senior devs on your team or your boss, review your code before it goes in, which is a great way to get feedback, as well as to make sure that there's no bugs being introduced. So definitely Git has a lot of like bells and whistles to it, but at its core, there's a few simple commands that I cannot stress enough, like how much it's going to make your development process easier and just better all around if you learn them. Next slide, please. Yeah, so,
Sorry.
all good.
We're on 7, right?
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
So something that's really different between writing code for class and writing code for work is the longevity of your code. So generally for class, you'll spend a couple weeks on a project, you'll write the code, and then you'll move on to the next thing and never look at that project again. Maybe you'll copy a function or two that you've written, but pretty much you don't go backwards, you only go forwards. Whereas for work, your code is going to be around for years. I've been at CoStar for almost 3 years, and the vast majority of what I've written in that time is still in the code base. As well as there's lots of other people who are going to be reading your code. I am on a team of 6 people. The code that I'm working on, there's 3 or 4 other teams also touch it. And so anything that you write, you need to make sure that it's not just sort of slapped together just to get something out. You want to take the time and make sure that it's clean, definitely that it's bug free, but in addition to just working, making sure that it's something that is going to be easy for other people who didn't write it, or yourself 2 years later coming back to it, making sure that it's easy for you to understand and for your team members to understand what the code actually does without spending 20 minutes, trawling through each line to try to figure out what it's doing. And a big part of what makes something readable is giving your variables and your functions meaningful names. So not having, like variable A or function, this does stuff, but something like is read only or format buildings for UI display, something like that, where you can sort of go through a file and see like, okay, I generally understand what's going on even before you dive into the actual meat of the functions. Another good thing is pretty much every language or framework or whatever you're using has design patterns that are sort of like community accepted standards for how to write the language. That might be things like capitalization patterns or naming conventions. things like that. Whether or not you use, like if they're optional, having the semicolons at the end, as well as whatever company you end up working for might have their own set of style guidelines. And these are important. Um, you might be able to find tools like in JavaScript, we have something called Prettier that sort of does it for you. Um, there's also linters that'll detect this for you, but it's definitely important to be aware of the common design patterns for the tools that you're using, because it's going to make it a lot easier to read code if it's all consistent, especially within a team. If everyone is following the same pattern, then it's going to make reading other people reading your code easier, as well as you trying to figure out what other people's code does. Because inevitably, there's going to be, you'll write something and then the business will decide, oh, we really like that, we want to expand on it. And so now you have to go back and modify what you've written before. So you're constantly having to go look at old code, maybe refactor it if you're lucky and have time, or just sort of build and expand on it. And something that I've actually had this happen to me a few times is sometimes it's better to have readable code than like the most efficient, super slick one line code possible. I've definitely fallen into this trap a few times where I've like put a map function inside of a reduce with like spread variables and it all looks super slick and I've used all the cool new tools. And then my bosses come to me and it's like, hey, Rachel, like, I don't know what this does. Maybe make it a little bit more readable. And so I had to go back like, okay, I can pull this out into a loop or a helper function or something. And so it really is at the end of the day important to make sure that not only your code works, but that it's easy to read. And keeping in mind readability as a priority in itself is going to be super helpful going forward. Next slide, please. And then technologies. So on the left, you have, comes from Stack Overflow's yearly survey of what the most common languages among professional developers are. And so I know at VCU, at least the classes that I took, it's primarily Java and Python that you use. You maybe have touched some of the other ones during your time there. But odds are good that wherever you end up, you're going to encounter a language that isn't what you learned. And you're going to have to learn it fairly quickly. Even if you do end up going somewhere where they use Java or Python or whatever you're used to, there's probably going to be a different framework, as well as like design patterns constantly change, technologies constantly change. And so being able to learn a new technology quickly is a skill in itself and is one that's never going to stop being useful for you. So even as well on top of that, like the company that you go to will probably have its own internal libraries, might have its own proprietary software. For instance, when I joined CoStar, not only did I inherit like a several thousand file project, but we also have a lot of internal helper functions for like common components, some libraries for that, as well as libraries for hooking up the backend. So those are all things like having their own internal documentation that I wouldn't find outside of CoStar, but I had to learn when I joined. So reading the documentation is a really good thing to get into the practice of doing. Generally, any external project or framework is going to have pretty good documentation, mostly. Varies by the software. But just get in the habit, especially now, like just reading the documentation to get a feel for what you're learning. And another thing that you can do is practice. Practice is the best way to learn anything. I'm going to bring this up several times. Just like have side projects. That's, I think, the best way to learn any new technology is just by using it, because you can, watch a video or do a tutorial, but it's never going to be as helpful of if you just dive in and start making something with the language. Next slide, please. Yeah, so for each of these three sections, I want this to be like a very practical guide to how to actually help bridge this gap, so that you're prepared when you go into your first job. And so I'm going to have like practice slides of things that you can start doing right now, even before you graduate, to start working on these skills. And so for the hard skill section, definitely version control your class projects. Like get Git set up on your machine and use it for everything you do. It's going to make your life easier. And it's also like, if you can get the hang of like creating a repo, making a branch, committing, pushing, pulling, merging, that's really all you need to know to get started. And is going to be the bulk of what you do. So definitely for all your class projects, I highly recommend using Git. And then something that you can do to practice getting your code to be readable is after you finish a project, definitely after you turn it in, don't do this before you turn it in. But find someone else in your class and see if you can do a code review. Like, look at their code, see if you can follow along what they're doing, get used to reading other people's code, give them some feedback on how they could improve it. Both from a functionality perspective, but more so from a code style perspective, and then have them do the same for you. So you can get used to, like, maybe you have really long functions and it's hard to follow along, or something like your naming of conventions could be better. Just little things to get used to other people looking at your code besides just your teacher. And then another big thing is think about what you want to do. Do you want to be a front-end developer? You should probably learn JavaScript. Do you want to be a back-end developer? Maybe Java, maybe C Sharp. But think about where you want to end up, what you like doing, and then what technologies are popular at companies you might want to work for, or roles that you want to go into. And then just work on a project using those, start practicing. Even better, collaborate on that project so you can get used to having pull requests go in, working with other people, delegating tasks, sort of thing. Next slide, please. All right, so now we covered the hard skills, so now we're going to talk about soft skills, which are just as important as the technology. Next slide, please. So Agile programming is a really common pattern that a lot of businesses use, that essentially is you have a large project and you break it down into 1 to 3 week, what they're called sprints. And so you have that period of time for the whole team to accomplish a chunk of work. And generally within that chunk of work, you divide that into what's known as stories, which are just smaller pieces, and you might get assigned 1 or 2 stories. And that's your responsibility to complete those stories over the course of the sprint. And so there's 2 key parts of that I think are really important to learn, and some of the hardest things to get started with. So the first is tasking. So you're presented with a large chunk of work, and tasking is a way to divide that into sort of like little atomic bits that you can, like, once, maybe it'll take you maybe no more than like 6 hours to complete a given task. And then that not only shows progress, but also helps you in the planning to think about all of the steps that you need to take to complete your story. So for instance, so I'm a front-end developer, so that's going to be my example, but say I had to build a form for registration. So some tasks that I might create would be to do the UI of the fields. So like if any need to be drop downs or anything like that, that could be maybe its own task if it's big enough. Maybe styling is a separate task. If there's any validation that needs to happen, like passwords have to be the same or emails have to match regex, like that might be its own task. And then the like submitting of the form, packaging the data, sending it off, that could be its own. I work in React, so like managing state, that might be its own task. So that sort of thing. You sort of get the idea of like each of them has its own sort of like self-contained bit adding up to the whole, which is getting the registration form. And then hand in hand with tasking is estimation. This for me was the absolute hardest thing. I remember the first time that someone asked me to estimate how long a task would take, I just stared at them blankly. It's like, I have no idea. I haven't done it yet. And this will definitely come with time, and it's really the only way to get better at this is to just do it more, practice. You'll get a sense of how long things take you once you start thinking about it. But generally during planning, you'll have to, it doesn't have to be exact. You'll be asked like, oh, how long is that going to take you? Because the business folks want to allocate hours, plan accordingly, maybe delegate tasks to different people. And generally for this, I always recommend padding your estimates. Be like 25% padding. because if you can get it done under time, people will be happy with you. And it'll just look extra good if you pad your estimate. But if you end up going over, it's not going to be the end of the world, but you won't look quite as good. So always pad your estimates. I still do that because also things inevitably take longer than you expect if you haven't looked at the code yet. Next slide, please. Yeah, so another really important soft skill is communication and understanding who you're going to be talking to. So generally as a student, you pretty much only talk with other developers, whether it's like your teacher or your classmates, but other people who are deep into coding along with you. But when you get onto a team at a job, there's probably going to be a lot of non-technical team members as well as developers. So these are people like designers, project managers, business analysts who are crucial to getting the project that you're working on done, but who don't have that deep coding knowledge like you do. And oftentimes, usually like a good example is when I was at Authentic, we had a whole team of in-house designers who did all of the mock-ups for what we were building. And there's a lot of times where they would put something in thinking it was really simple, but just because of the implementation details, it would end up being like a whole week of work to do something that they thought was simple. And so I'd have to go and explain like at a high level why something needed to be changed or to clarify something. So that's a good skill to have, is just being able to explain what you're doing without getting super technical, because not everybody is going to value that or understand what you're talking about. Sometimes, depending on where you are, you might have to interact with the client. If you do, always be respectful. 100% always respect them. They're the one giving you the business. And then if you're talking with a client, the most important thing to do is to listen. You really want to understand what they're asking for, what they value, at a very detailed level. So you want to make sure that you have all of the requirements down, because even if you build something that's like a good product, but if it's not what they're looking for, they're not going to be happy. You'll generally have frequent meetings with a client, but definitely that's the time to like ask all of the questions that you have and make sure that you really, really, really understand what they're looking for. And sometimes the client might be a team member. Like I work on an internal piece of software right now, and so our client is the project manager on our team who works with the business side. So that's a little bit less formal, but still definitely good to make sure that you have all the requirements before you start working, or as soon as you encounter something that you have questions about, making sure that you ask, so you're not working blind or on assumptions. And then finally, there'll be other developers. This is something that you're used to. It's going to be pretty similar. They're probably going to be more experienced people. You'll generally go in as the most junior person on a team. And so something good to figure out from the start is who has expertise in various areas, so that you know who to ask when you run into different problems, because everyone's going to have different areas of understanding that they've been working in. So even the most senior person might not be the best person to ask if, say, another junior developer has been working in a particular area. And I encourage all of you to ask a lot of questions, but also at the same time be aware of other people's time, and always try to figure out a problem yourself first before going to other people. That's a really good habit to get into. Next slide, please. Yeah, so this section as well, you can practice some of these skills. So Trello, if you're unfamiliar, is free software that you can use for project planning. So you can make stories, you can make tasks within stories, you can assign hours estimates, move them sort of along from started to complete, or like to active to done. And I recommend doing that for every one of your programming assignments. It's a really good practice, especially with the estimates. If you make estimates in advance, and then if you actually track the hours accurately, then at the end, you can look at each of those estimates versus the actual time it took. And you can see if you were close, if you were wildly off, if you were over, if you were under, and just get more data points so that you can get better at estimating for when it actually matters for your job. And then for communication, that's a little bit harder to practice now just because of the environment that you're in. But if you can, collaborate on a project with people who aren't developers. Like maybe you have a friend who's a graphic designer, and you can get them to design maybe a portfolio website or something like that. And hackathons are a really good time to do this. You maybe have like a business friend or a designer friend, you can come together and start working on that. So you can get used to sort of talking about technical things in a non-technical way. Next slide, please. So finally is the right mindset, which I think is actually the most important of these 3 sections. Next slide, please. Yeah, so takeaway here is just be a sponge. Absorb as much knowledge as you can. Because when you go into your first job, you're not going to be the expert. And that's not only acceptable and okay, but it's a great opportunity to just learn as much as you can, because everybody is going to be, everyone was a junior dev at one point and has been in your shoes and knows how important it is to share the knowledge that they have. So people are going to be very helpful. And something, this is something that I got from one of my coworkers, and I was asking for their advice on this topic. Someone said something that I thought was interesting, which is that it's okay to be wrong. I think that this is important to understand and to keep in mind, that like you're not going to be perfect. Nobody's perfect. Even someone who's been doing this for 20 years is not perfect. And especially someone who's just starting out is not going to be perfect. And so it's okay to make mistakes. It's okay to say that you don't know something. In those situations, take them as learning opportunities. Like if someone's talking about something and you have no idea what they're talking about, stop them and ask, rather than just sort of sitting on it and maybe trying to guess. Just ask, and people will explain it to you. And every time that someone explains something or you encounter something, where a particular bit of code lives or something like that, keep notes as you're doing this, because it's super embarrassing and awkward if you have to go to the same person who's just helped you like a day later and be like, hey, I forgot. No one wants to ask the same question multiple times. So make sure that you keep notes from everything that you've learned. And then going along with be a sponge is just always be learning. This field changes so quickly, and it's one of the most fun things about being a developer is that there's always something new to learn. The technologies change yearly, sometimes monthly. And so there's always something new to learn, and everyone around you is a resource, not just the most senior people, but your peers, like people at the same level as you. Also, they've probably been working on something different. So you can always learn from everyone, and make sure that you take the opportunity to ask as many questions as you can and just soak up knowledge. And along with that is asking for feedback. So sort of like hard skills feedback, which you'll probably get from like code reviews or PR requests or that sort of thing. But there's also the soft skills reviews. And I highly recommend just asking like your boss for feedback. I was lucky both Authentic and CoStar have regular one-on-ones where I would just meet with my direct boss and just talk about the work that I've been doing. And then I would always ask for feedback. And I recommend doing that because sometimes there's things that you don't notice, especially when you're starting out and you don't have as much experience in an office setting, that you might not realize that you're doing. And it's good to get those sort of things clarified, so that you can fix them if there are any issues. Next slide, please. Yeah, so this is something that you can also practice, this sort of like constant learning. Obviously, you're a student, so you're in an environment devoted to learning. But the difference is that when you're a student, it's very curated. You have lectures set up in advance, there's a curriculum. It's all sort of laid out in front of you. It's like, these are the things that you're going to be learning this month or this semester. But learning is also, it's going to be more self-driven once you graduate. And so getting into the practice of self-learning is important. As I mentioned a few times now, always have a side project. I think this is hands down the best way to learn anything. Just by find out what interests you or something that you're gonna need probably for your job, and then just build something. It doesn't have to be anything impressive. Really just any project is good because it's mostly just practice, as well as it looks good on your resume or your portfolio. And then as you're working, whether it's on your side project or things for class, if you come across a function or something that's part of the language that you're using and it's something that you don't know, look it up. Don't just gloss over it and think like, oh, I don't need to know really how that works. It's fine. I'm just copying the code. No, take the time, look it up, learn how it works, and get that detailed knowledge of the tools that you're using and really think about the tools that you're using. And finally, you're already doing this because you're at my talk, but go to talks, go to meetups, go to conferences. Pretty much everything is remote now, which is really nice conference-wise because you don't have to travel to go to, you don't have to go to San Francisco or Seattle or something to go to some of the top conferences. They're all digital. And so you can just tune into those. Tickets are probably way cheaper too. As well as in Richmond, there's several technology meetups from there's Python ones, there's JavaScript ones, there's a whole host of different topics. So it's easy to find those as well as articles, blogs. Those are really good ways to stay on top of the latest developments. So as you're learning and as you're continuing to learn, those are good resources as well. Next slide, please. Yeah, so those are the big things that I wanted to cover. We've got a few minutes, I think like 10-15 minutes left. So I can take any questions as well as my emails at the bottom of the slide. So if we don't get to your question or you think of anything later, feel free to reach out to me. And thank you all for listening.
I have a quick question if you don't mind.
Yeah.
So you mentioned earlier that when you're talking to other developers, right, that you should ask them questions, but you should try it first. I'm just curious if you have a rule of thumb for how long you should try something by yourself beforehand.
Definitely more than 10 minutes, probably not more than a couple hours. It depends on what you're trying to do. Like if you feel like you're making progress in getting closer to it, keep doing it. But if you spent, if you've spent more than an hour and you really have no idea what's going on, or you feel like there's one little key piece that you're missing, definitely ask. But you don't want to at least at that point you've played around with it enough that you can ask an intelligent question and be like, I've tried this, and this, and it doesn't work. But rather than oh, I just got stuck and I don't know what it's doing. Yeah, that sort of thing. Just give it your best shot.
All right, thank you.
Robin, I had a quick question. First of all, thank you for being here, and this is great. My question was, it sounds kind of like you and I took similar paths as far as getting a prior education and then kind of realizing we want to do something else and then returning to education again. So from that aspect, did you feel there was any sort of advantage or disadvantage to coming into this field as a professional at a later age than say some of these kids that are coming out of college at age 21 and they're fresh-eyed and brand new to the world?
I definitely think so. I guess to clarify, have you been working in industry or were you doing something completely different and this is your first coding?
No, I was an arts major originally. So I was a photographer for a long time. I'm graduating this semester. Working on an internship right now. Went from full-time over the summer to part-time, struggling through part-time right now with all of my class load. So, but that's where I'm at right now.
Yeah. Yeah, I definitely think that having work experience, even if it's unrelated work experience, it's going to be helpful because you know how jobs work and the sort of office politics and that sort of thing, how to manage your time. Those are all of those sort of soft skills, they're still useful. And so you have that going in. And so I know at least for me, it was useful having that industry knowledge. Even obviously I was a software developer, so I had some of the technical knowledge too, but just sort of knowing how things worked, it contextualizes what you're learning. And as well as being useful again once you return to industry. And so I think you're in a good spot because you've got that experience as well as the technical knowledge from your degree. So I think you seem like you're in a good spot. Best of luck. And definitely, also there's like a lot of people career switch, so that's not uncommon at all. So I would be surprised if you had like people discriminate. They're jerks if they do. It's really common.
Yeah, I was thinking, I have a million questions. I just didn't want to take up your time in case anyone else wanted to jump in. But I guess I was thinking of lots of different aspects, obviously, one of which would definitely also be maybe generational changes and things like that, in the workplace environment, maybe working with folks that are, have a varying ages and experiences, life experiences, personalities, obviously. So like coming into a field, I can speak from my own experience, like coming back to school and having 6 to 8 years on everyone in my classes, there was definitely like a generational gap between us. And in some aspects, I sometimes had found it a little more challenging to find a meeting place for us to relate on like a personal level within like the scholastic and like professional world.
I think that becomes less important once you like college. Generally, people are like in a much more narrow band of ages on average. And so if you're not in that, like I was also the same thing when I went back to classes. I was like, I'm 5 years older than you. This is odd. But once you like get into the office, like, people are going to be all across ages. So it's more normal to interact with people who are like decades in age different. And I feel like also the sort of like norms of behaving, people like professional attitudes, like everyone kind of has that professional attitude, whether you're 20 or 50, versus college is a lot more casual. And so I would say that like that difference definitely doesn't really apply as much.
And then maybe my final question for now would be, how was the transition from the office life? I've been on that top floor with you guys before. I worked with CoStar for my senior capstone that I finished last spring. And how is it now working remotely after being in such a fun, tight-knit sort of ecosystem and having all that free hummus to going to working at home and maybe not having as much hummus?
Yeah, significantly less hummus. Um, but I think it hasn't been hugely different. I think it would be different if I was just starting a new job. I think that might have its own struggles. Um, but I know all of my coworkers, and the work itself, 100%, there's no difference. Like I can do the same work remotely, because I can still communicate with people if I have questions. There's no difference there. Um, I think it's definitely like for any of you who are like entering, if we're still in quarantine when you start, that's going to be a bit of a struggle that everyone is going to deal with, of just like how do you introduce yourself to people or get to know people, when you don't have that face-to-face communication. But definitely from a work perspective, this is a really good industry for being in quarantine, because you shouldn't be very much affected by that, because you don't have to be on site to code.
Cool.
There's some great questions. Thank you. I wanted to also share with everyone that you're welcome to upload your resume into the link that is in the chat box.
I have a question. I'm sorry, I joined a little late. I don't know if you talked about this before. But during like the interview process, how technical do the questions get for CoStar? Like, do we have to know like some advanced like algorithms, or is it like you have to be really good with the basics?
So it's a mix. You probably won't have any whiteboarding questions. I at least did not when I joined. It was more about what my experiences were, what I'd worked in. I had a couple years experience coming in, so it might be slightly different. I haven't actually done any of the interviews. Drew, I don't know, you might be able to speak to this as well, but generally like my interview was, I got a lot of sort of like knowledge questions, the sort of, I guess, more them trying to gauge like what my familiarity was with what I'd be working with, as well as just more questions about my experience, because I think CoStar does a good job of like knowing that on the spot algorithms questions don't really reflect how you would be as an employee. So that's I don't know about other companies, but at least CoStar, it's more like knowledge and experiences over like, can you code without a debugger on paper in 20 minutes?
Okay, thank you.
To jump on his question, how prepared did you feel for that exam, or rather that interview, coming from the experience that you had through Max Potential and Authentic? Did you feel like you were prepared with a lot of the technical questions, or were you, or did they understand that you were still in the process of learning as well?
So I think I had been working in a similar area. Like I was already working as a front-end developer for a couple of years. They asked me a lot of CSS questions, which luckily I knew a lot about, and some React, which I think the reason that I felt prepared was not only did I have like the work experience, but I like was really interested in React, and so I was working on my own projects on the side, and so I had that knowledge to draw on as well, which is why side projects is having those is really useful. Um, but always, I mean, there's definitely some questions that they asked me that I didn't know the answers to, and generally my tactic when I encounter that is to sort of turn it around and not get hung up on like, oh, I don't know this, I'm not going to pass, but just show them that you're willing to learn, because they can't ask, like, you're not going to know everything going in. There's always going to be something new because there probably is internal software that you don't know or it'll change. So a big thing that interviewers for developer roles want to know is that you can learn and that you are willing and excited to learn. So if there's something that you don't know, they ask you about, just say like, wow, I've never encountered that before. Like, can you explain it to me? And then you'll come away with more knowledge and you'll show that you have that willingness to learn. So that's usually what I do, is like, just ask.
Hi, I had another question. So I don't know if you said this earlier, but I know like different companies use like different like technology specific to them. Is there any like software tools or like programming that CoStar like mainly uses?
So are you looking more at front end, back end, or
Both, I guess,
database
yeah.
work? Sorry.
Mainly front end and back end.
Uh, well, that's pretty broad. So front end, it depends on what office. In Richmond, we usually use React, JavaScript based front end, like your standard. We've been using TypeScript, some, but mostly JavaScript for some of the older repos. CSS we use less for CSS, and then so I like my backend knowledge isn't as good. I don't work with it as much, but it's like .NET based there, MySQL, and then we sort of have a middle tier layer that's like, we call it the backend for front end, and that was Node, and now we've been trying to implement a lot more with GraphQL. So those are sort of the big ones.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, hi, I have another question. So I have an interest in machine learning, and I know CoStar has some machine learning like programs, I guess. I was just interested if you've ever used machine learning in your job, or how I would get into it.
So CoStar's Richmond office has very little machine learning going on. I think the Boston office has more. That's where a lot of the economists are. And I imagine that they're doing a lot more with that sort of thing. I am pretty unfamiliar with that work. The CoStar office is the research headquarters, so it's a lot of building the like internal tools for researchers. Yeah, I can't really speak to what I think. There's a little bit going on at CoStar. I'm not exactly sure. Sorry, that wasn't more helpful.
I can answer a little bit more related to like machine learning opportunities. So We do have a lot of students that are constantly asking about machine learning positions, data science positions. Unfortunately, at this time, we're not recruiting for any positions, entry level roles for that specific team. Like Rachel said, our team of machine learning engineers is very, very small, and we're still very much in kind of an exploratory phase of what that looks like and how the team is going to grow moving forward.
All right, thank you.
If you're looking into machine learning and are having trouble finding opportunities like data work, like getting used to using databases is probably a good place to start as well, because that's a big part of it, is just like being able to handle large quantities of data.
Yeah, I mean, that makes sense.
Robin, do you personally do any work with the databases from the front end? I would imagine mostly just making calls to and from, but.
I occasionally have to write SQL code, and it is nerve-wracking because I'm bad at it. So CoStar is pretty big, and this is going to be like, the bigger the company, the more true it is that you won't have to touch as many different things. But if you're at a smaller company, you're probably going to have more roles, and you might have to be a full stack developer. I don't like the backend as much, so I try to stay away from it. But occasionally I'll have to write SQL code or like some C# code, and I don't like doing it, but I've done it.
I also realized that I keep calling you Robin, so I apologize for that.
You're fine.
Yeah. Well, because my question was, I know that you all have been migrating a lot of your relational databases to Mongo, and so my follow-up to that was whether or not you saw that transition from like any pain points during your development process.
So I actually haven't been on the Mongo projects yet. I'm about to be. We actually had a presentation today where they sort of like introduced my team to what's been going on. Yeah, there's a big push right now. We're sort of redoing a lot of our software to make it, it's like homogeneous is the right word, across. So there's like 15 different applications, probably more than that, probably more like 100 different applications right now that all look different, that are all like different access points, and they're trying to unify those under sort of like one overarching layer, but different bits underneath it. And I know that that's like, they're using like Docker for that, and the database is Mongo. I think it's still React mostly on the front end. I haven't specifically worked with that, unfortunately. I can't talk very much to it.
Any other questions?
Like we have a few dropping off.
Yeah, as I said, my email's on the slides, so if those get sent out, feel free to reach out if you think of anything later.
Thank you so much, Rachel. That was awesome.
I'd like to thank you, Rachel, for the great presentation, and Drew, thank you so much for bringing CoStar on to RamDev, and I'd like to thank all of you for attending today.
Thanks for having us.
Of course.
All right. Thanks, everyone. I hope you all have a great evening.
Thank you.
Thanks.